in your mind as to who you will be voting for. That can be because of party loyalty or because you align yourself closely with a particular candidate's values and beliefs, whatever it may be. But I think tonight's presentation has a twofold purpose. First, for those who have already decided who they will be voting for, this presentation may confirm your decision. But there are many people who are sincerely struggling with the decision as to who they should vote for and why. Undecided voters tend to weigh multiple factors: policy specifics, a candidate's character, or how the issues will affect people personally. They may be torn between competing priorities or uncertain about the candidate's ability to deliver on their promises, making their decision more complex and requiring a little bit more time. This evening, Peter, in his very well-developed talk, will lay out for us some of the issues before us in this election, and he'll offer some insights to making our decisions based on some of the teachings of our Catholic faith, the scriptures, the Ten Commandments, the rich social teachings of our church, and even some encyclicals. And might I also, at the outset, remind and encourage any unregistered voter that you still have time to register, and you can do so by simply going to vote.org. And so now allow me just to say a word or two about our three speakers. So Peter Steinfels, as you know, is a journalist and a teacher, but he's really best known for his writings on religion and religious topics. Peter is a native of Chicago and a lifelong Roman Catholic. He earned his PhD from Columbia, and he began writing for Commonweal as far back as 1964. Over the years, Peter, along with his wife Peggy, have both been editors of Commonweal magazine. Peter served as a visiting professor at Notre Dame and Georgetown. Peter also authored several books. Peter has been a professor at Fordham University, and along with his wife Peggy, they were both founders and co-directors of the Fordham Center on Religion and Culture. In 2003, Peter was awarded the Laetare Medal by the University of Notre Dame, the oldest and the most prestigious award for American Catholics. Peter has been a parishioner of Ascension for the past 20-plus years, and he remains actively involved in our OCIA program. Amina Elderfield. Amina is a managing director at Morgan Stanley, where she leads a portfolio of corporate communication functions, including internal communications, digital strategy for morganstanley.com, social media, and the firm's history and archives. Prior to her current role, Amina was the COO for the Global Technology Strategy, Innovation, and Partnerships teams at J.P. Morgan Chase. She holds a BA and a BSBA in Management Technology from Georgetown, as well as a Master's in Gastronomy from the University of Adelaide in South Australia. From 2020 to 2023, Amina served as the president of the Brearley Alumni Association, serving on the Board of Trustees during that time as well. And like Peter, I think Amina too has been a parishioner of Ascension for some 20-plus years. And Will Layden. He's the chief of staff of Cube Hydro Partners, a developing and operating platform targeting investments in hydro projects in the US and in Canada. But before joining Cube Hydro, Will served as a special assistant to the White House Chief of Staff in the Obama administration. Before his role in the Office of the Chief of Staff, he held positions in President Obama's Office of Legislative Affairs, primarily working with the U.S. House of Representatives. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from NYU and a postgraduate degree from Harvard. So let's give our three very accomplished speakers a very warm word of applause.
I want to thank Father Carney and all who had a hand in arranging this evening, and all of you who turned out for this session. Here are some things that I don't need to tell you. First, that we're in the midst of a Category 4 presidential election. Second, that religion is a big part of that storm. Third, that the leading issues are cost of living, immigration, abortion, war in the Middle East and Ukraine, the future of our constitutional democracy, and the temperaments of the contending candidates. I'm not going to rehearse this evening what you can hear on cable TV. Finally, I'm not going to do much more than remind you of the vast treasury of our religious teaching that bears on our public as well as our private lives. We could begin with the Ten Commandments, with their injunctions against lying, stealing, and doing violent harm to others. We could move on to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes and his parables and his exemplary healings and what he called the law and the prophets, which he distilled into the two great commandments: love your God with your whole heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. It is true that there are complications, even apparent contradictions in all these teachings. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And he also taught us to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." This is why we call upon the Holy Spirit and centuries of scholars and saints to help us apply these teachings. Throughout most of those centuries, votings and elections were hardly on the horizon. Now they are, and that's not the only change. The laws spelled out in the Hebrew Scriptures and the discourses and parables of Jesus were not without social implications, but they were articulated largely in a world of small-scale communities and of face-to-face, person-to-person relationships. That world remains. Yet over the last centuries, that world has also become one of increasingly complicated social systems and social structures, economic, political, cultural institutions. Modern communications and transportation have not only made us aware, often painfully, of things happening on other continents, but also, and more so perhaps, of how much our own actions or inactions can affect what happens on other continents. It wasn't until 2002, I think, that I became familiar with the term supply chain. This modern transformation did not abolish all those direct obligations to our neighbor. On the contrary, it enlarged them. Now we recognize our obligations to respond not only to the poor, but to poverty. Not only to assist the blind, the ill, the abandoned, the imprisoned, but also to address the causes of blindness, disease, abandonment, and incarceration. Not only to bind up the wounds of the victim of robbers on the road to Jericho, but also the victims of war and famine thousands of miles away. Not only to those alive now, but to generations yet to come. And that is why the word social appears in Catholic social teachings, which since the 19th century has been spelled out in papal encyclicals, episcopal statements, and theological reflections, and lived out in Catholic movements and ministries. First Leo XIII and Pius XI applied ancient teachings to new industrial realities. Then other popes applied them to international disparities in economic development, to personal rights and responsibilities, modern warfare, and most recently to ecological and environmental and climate perils. I am sure that many here this evening have worked to apply these teachings through not-for-profit organizations or in private enterprises. But government always remains a key actor. It prevents harms and incentivizes benefits. It creates or funds programs to help those in need. It enforces laws and resolves disputes, which brings us back to voting and elections. What is the role of our faith and convictions? One effort to address that question directly came from the American Catholic bishops. In the mid-70s, they started issuing statements the year before presidential elections about the political issues facing the nation. Eventually, these bore the title Faithful Citizenship or Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. The bishops made two basic claims about their statements. One, they were not telling Catholics how to vote. And two, they did not want Catholics to be single-issue voters. Almost 50 years later, they are saying the same thing. The sticking point, of course, has been abortion. Writing just after Roe v. Wade, the bishops naturally highlighted it as an issue. And when they listed issues of concern by alphabetical order, abortion very conveniently came first. Now let me remind you that at that time, Republicans were actually a little bit more likely to be pro-choice than Democrats. The dynamics of political rivalry soon changed that. The culture wars, feminism, and the political rise of religious conservatives pushed the Republicans in one direction and the Democrats in the other. And pressed by the pro-life movement and frustrated by Catholic pro-choice politicians, many of them Democrats, the bishops made succeeding editions of Faithful Citizenship increasingly emphatic about abortion and a few other related issues. The emphasis was naturally seized upon by pro-life and pro-Republican activists and a few very outspoken, magnified by a few very outspoken bishops. And not surprisingly, this left the impression that, one, the bishops were telling Catholics how to vote, and two, they did want Catholics to be single issue or maybe handful of issue voters. But even if that had not occurred, much that was very valuable in these statements was undermined by several other flaws. The obvious one is that, except in referendums, we don't actually vote on issues or policies. We vote for candidates. Candidates come in strange mixes. They usually advocate a package of policies, some of which, by our faith-based standards, are good, but others not so good or bad. Some of which they might be able to enact, while others, depending on the overall political landscape or the state of public opinion, have to remain on their wish lists. Candidates may have admirable or appealing public positions on issues, but in reality, they may be persons of low integrity or dubious temperament. How does their conduct or their rhetoric shape our public morality? How would they handle an emergency or crucial issue that cannot even be anticipated at the time of an election? Can they be relied on to deal with it soberly, honestly, and constitutionally? The last word conjures up a problem that the bishops never contemplated when they last redrafted their statement and were reluctant to address last fall. Today, most political parties and both political parties, I should say, and presidential candidates accuse their opponents of threatening the fundamental institutions and norms that safeguard our democratic form of government. Whose accusations are to be taken seriously, and on what grounds? Or is this nothing but meaningless campaign exaggerations? I leave it to you to decide. Your decision is vital, however, because if the accusations are true on one side or the other side, or both sides, they overshadow almost everything else in the election. I regret that the bishops evaded that issue, but they've been made aware of their statements' other problems. The fact that we vote for candidates who come with morally mixed agendas, with politically mixed possibilities of enacting them, and with psychologically mixed temperaments and characters. How do we balance all that out? The bishop's answer, and mine, is the virtue of prudence. It is a virtue often misunderstood as mere caution or even timidity. Prudence is the insight, the perception, the intuition, the reflex with which we somehow take all these things into account in making a moral judgment. We exercise prudence in deciding what political claims or political leaders to trust, what outcomes are likely, what risks are reasonable, What can be measured and compared, but also what cannot? There is no mathematical formula for prudence. It demands a certain feel, like catching a fly ball, playing the piano, calming a child, or driving a car. We call it a virtue because it is something that must become ingrained over time and perfected through practice. Growth in prudence can involve everything from prayer and reflection to the study of history, the deepening of our empathy by shared suffering, the stretching of our imagination through literature, and of course the recognition of our own biases and weaknesses, for instance, in reading character or understanding politics. Thomas Aquinas called the virtue of prudence the master virtue, or the rudder virtue, because it steers all the other virtues in dealing with specific and concrete cases. Of course, none of us can be expert about all the concrete cases an election brings forward. The causes and consequences of immigration, of inflation, of tariffs, of tax cuts, of crime, of restricting abortion. So the exercise of prudence requires trust. Whom should we trust? Whom should we believe? Well, to some extent, those who share our own values. That makes sense. Yet it also risks imprisoning ourselves in a kind of information bubble. Politically, we come to live out a vicious circle. We base our political judgments on the information we trust, and we base our trust of information on our political judgments. My personal solution to this problem is captured in an ugly and, I'm afraid, untheological sounding term: trade-offs. There is hardly a concrete policy proposal that does not involve some trade-off. Losers as well as winners, short-term versus long-term. It would be nice to assume that the long-term winners will be almost all of us, and the short-term losers will only be that infamous 1%. I doubt that the reality is so tidy. Take one of Pope Francis's major concerns: care of our planetary home. The more we learn of the trade-offs of ceasing reliance on fossil fuels, the more we learn that some of the immediate costs may fall on already vulnerable people. Or to be still more provocative, consider the Holy Father's signature cause, the care and welcoming of migrants. He's not wrong. The problem of displaced people is massive and horrible. We see it in the suffering of people trying to cross the Mediterranean or Central America's Darien Gap, though even may occur in less visible ways in the cases the fate of mothers and infants driven by war and famine into refugee camps in places like Sudan and Congo. It is absolutely right that our parish responded readily to the needs of Venezuelans arrived here in New York City. But it is also true that the cultural shock and economic strain of sudden migration, sometimes real, sometimes demagogically exaggerated, have fueled the rise of anti-immigrant political parties whose growing success now threatens everything that the Pope hopes for. And migration has created incentives, sometimes whole new businesses, often gang-affiliated, designed to entice migrants by assisting them, but also leading many, both genuine asylum seekers and classic economic immigrants, to robbery, rape, and death. Migration has to be viewed not only as a person-to-person moral obligation, but also as a social system with its own dynamic and trade-offs. Such trade-offs do not resolve the moral problem of border policies, or of climate policies, or of tariff and manufacturing policies, or of abortion bans, or of dealing with Russia, China, Iran, and Israel. But in choosing whom and what to believe and trust, as I go about making my prudential political judgments, I often look to acknowledgments of trade-offs as a litmus test for credibility. I have limited my remarks to a handful of points. Loving our neighbor in 2024 means addressing the needs of neighbors continents away and maybe even decades away, as well as those whom we personally face. It means addressing social systems and institutions that can cause or relieve our neighbor's condition. Because government is the key factor in doing this, our votes are profoundly moral choices about loving our neighbors. We vote for policies, but first of all for candidates who come in complex mixes. And we do all this by exercising the virtue of prudence. And for me at least, exercising prudence requires awareness of trade-offs. The bishops did accompany their latest statement with a new introductory note. It lamented that although our opportunity to vote should be an occasion for gratitude and hope, in reality, elections have become, and I quote, a time of anxiety and spiritual trial. Political rhetoric is increasingly angry, seeking to motivate primarily through division and hatred. How can we meet this challenge? The note asks. Spend time in silence with Scripture and the Blessed Sacrament rather than social media and TV. Volunteer, serve the poor, pray. But also they write, and I quote again, grow in the virtue of prudence, learn from trustworthy sources, and do our best to make wise judgments. The note continues and concludes, may God bless our nation with true wisdom, peace, and mutual forgiveness, that we may decide together through our democratic processes to uphold the dignity of life and the common good. And I can only second that prayer. God, give us wisdom. God, have mercy. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Peter. That was, I saw it earlier. Can you hear me now? Oh, sound. Thank you, Peter. That was really incredibly thought-provoking and quite important to hear. My remarks will be fewer and they're more personal as I think about myself and my relationship to community. I would be remiss not to talk about the role and the power of the female voice within our church and within our community at this time of thinking about giving consideration to our elected officials. You know, it's not surprising that we, as I look out in the crowd, are mothers, we're daughters, we're aunties, tías, we're hermanas, we're sisters. But more fundamentally, even if you're not a parent or you're not a mom, we're carers, we're nurturers, we're guides. Sometimes we lead from the front, sometimes we have to lead from the back, but we're always there, we persist. And as you know, Pope Francis said, the church itself is a woman. Remember that. It's a daughter, a bride, and a mother. And as voters, I'm not sure I feel, and I feel today, that our voice as voters is probably the most important in any time that I can say in my 48 years on earth. And I think it really underscores the importance of us understanding that from a female lens, we understand what it means to be in community. We understand what it means to not be in community and to be in distress in our communities. You know, and I think about, you know, what we did during the synod. We talked about the joys of being Catholic, right? We talked, and I think there were so many beautiful things we talked about at this parish and beyond. But we also talked about our struggles. You know, you think about the communications that you have with your own community of women, whether it is violence, you know, in the home, whether it is financial inequity or financial instability, whether it's just injustice or abuse. These are things that are real things that happen in our homes, in our communities. Maybe not always discussed, but certainly things that persist and that really do impact women as we journey in the world. Let alone we forget day-to-day accountabilities, raising children, making sure our households are managed well, making sure the laundry's done, making sure all the great things are happening, that school's happening, that we're also taking care of our aging parents, and that everyone's happy and steady and at peace in our homes. And we think about often, as Peter so eloquently mentioned, the issues that have been raised in this election cycle are directly, I'm not sure I can point to any one of them that doesn't have a direct impact on women. So whether it's, I tend to not say as much abortion, I tend to more talk about women's health and women's agency in their health decisions. Certainly the economy, jobs, equity of the same job that I do is the same job that Peter does, that making sure that there's equity, financial equity there, which allows for options and opportunities forward. I think about gun violence and gun prevention that disproportionately impacts women and women's homes and their futures. I think about the climate, and I think as well about education, opportunities to succeed and to grow. And as Peter mentioned, this is really a collection of issues that it's not one or the other, it's sort of this whole portfolio that kind of works together, that's complicated, it's gnarly, it's complex, it's not easy. And really, as I go in my day-to-day activities, whether it's here or outside of the city, for some people the decision is very, very, very easy. It's very obvious to them. And then there's kind of the rest of us who kind of have to sit and grapple a little bit. And in truth, when I think about that, that's why I come to Mass every week. I'm grappling every week. I sit in the pews that you're in right now because life is not obvious. It's a little bit more complex than that. And so as I think about how I think about voting in the next 33 days, I think about giving myself that time to reflect, to be still, to find center, and to hear my truth, and to be earnest and be accountable for my truth. I also think it's a time for us to continue to convene, as Peter so beautifully said, not necessarily on social media, not necessarily through, pick a news station, but really to talk to each other and convene with each other and understand what is top of mind for my neighbors, the people that I live closest to. But I'll end with this statement, which I think is the practical nature of women. At the same time, we also need to plan. The reality is if we believe the numbers, half of us will be really happy with the election outcome, and half of us will not be happy with the election outcome. And I think, again, as women, we will have to persist and be strong and be very planful of how we all get to the other side and how we all maintain a sense of community.
Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Layden. I'm a parishioner here in this community. Father Carney has prepared my wife and I for our pre-cana previously, and afterward, he did such a good job, my wife actually got baptized here a couple months after our wedding. Maybe it would have been easier to do the baptism before, but we got the job done anyway. Before I kind of dig in, I wanted to share a little bit about my own personal journey in politics. It's funny thinking about this. It began more than 16 years ago back home in Illinois. I began as a volunteer for a little-known presidential candidate named Barack Obama, working in the Iowa caucuses. Later, I went down to Florida to support the campaign in 2012, and then I actually had the privilege of working in the White House in the West Wing with the president for the final 3 years of the administration. And listening to Peter's remarks, he kind of described, as well as the Catholic bishops described, prudence as an antidote to the election, a way for us to handle the trials of the election. And in the White House, we didn't use the term prudence, but we had our own framework for dealing with politics, and that was fight cynicism. This term, fight cynicism, came from a speech that President Obama gave, and he said, cynicism is a choice, but hope is a better choice. And when he said that, those words really resonated with me and with all staffers, so much so that we actually made little cards and stickers that said fight cynicism, and we handed them out to each other, somewhat jokingly, but somewhat earnestly, whenever we were feeling down. And that's the message I hope to share with you all tonight. It's too easy to get cynical about politics, especially when it feels like Washington and the media get distracted by things that don't really have an impact on our life. But cynicism and us getting cynical is really what the status quo relies on, frankly. There are a lot of vested interests are counting on us to disengage, and the more we disengage, the more entrenched that status quo becomes. So in this election cycle, we really can't afford to be cynical. And I know it's fashionable to be cynical. As New Yorkers, we critique things, we wear black, we're the coolest. But when it comes to politics, we need to leave that attitude behind. Cynicism didn't pass the Civil Rights Act. It didn't give women the right to vote and participate in politics. And cynicism certainly did not allow the Catholic faith to flourish. So I often tell myself this, and when I find myself discouraged about politics and the state of our country, America is not hypocritical, but it is a work in progress. And it's up to each of us to take up that unfinished work of those before us, speak out for what's right, challenge unjust status quo, and imagine a better world. And it actually starts with all of us here, and it starts with us in the voting booth. I was thinking about what maybe scripture I could call on to convey this message, and I looked at some notes on my phone, and I came to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 8, which says, "If the trumpet does not sound a clear call, who will get ready for battle?" Cynicism is that unclear call. It paralyzes us. It makes us question whether our actions really matter. But hope, that can be that clear call to action, and it rallies us. It prepares us to stand up, speak out, and take part in shaping our future. By fighting cynicism, we can be that trumpet. We can sound a clear call for our community and inspire others to get engaged, to believe their voice and their vote matters. And together, we can frankly reject the temptation to disengage and instead embrace our collective responsibility that we all share to shape our future in a better way. So that's all I had, but thanks for your time and for listening.
So thank you, Peter, Amina, and Will. We have time for just a few questions if there's anyone that may have a question, but I had just jotted down something that I was thinking of, and I'm not sure if it's a question or just a thought, and perhaps one of the three may wish to address it, but I'm troubled by the growing lack of honesty in politics, where truth seems to be increasingly compromised for power and personal gain. And I wonder if the erosion of integrity among politicians somehow undermines public trust and threatens the very foundations of our democracy. Because without transparency and accountability, I fear for the future of a society built on principles, fairness, and justice. Any thoughts?
I'm a member of a, is this on?
Yes.
Of a reading group that has been reading books in American history. And one thing that stands out is that lying is not new. What's new, I think, is the distribution of lies, which go faster and wider in no time at all. And I think that in this sense, particularly social media presents a challenge of a historical character that we have yet to grapple with. We all know that the invention of the printing press was a major factor in the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. I think that the invention of social media and digital generations is of a similar historic character, and that we really have to address that. So that's the only, otherwise I agree entirely with it's a very frightening problem. I remember when people were complaining about Twitter and free speech, and Elon Musk, I think, said, Twitter is the public square of the world, and it must have free speech. But it occurred to me that selling Twitter to the richest man in the world wasn't exactly a shrewd solution to that problem. And but that's where we are.
Any questions? Any other questions? Anyone have questions written or?
Reverend Father, honored guest lecturers, I am very sorry to say, because of the condition of the microphone, I understood almost nothing of what the four of you said. It was a disaster. I'm sorry to say.
Anyone else?
I have a question. I thought I saw in the headlines that the Pope said that Catholics should vote for the lesser of two evils. Was that something he actually said? And if you would you comment on it?
citizens should vote for the lesser of two evils. Is that accurate, and do you want to comment on that?
I believe the Pope did, in his style of making spontaneous remarks, say that both candidates were against life and that he wasn't telling anybody how to vote and that they should vote for the lesser of two evils. I don't know what to make about that. The Pope says a lot of things that I find illuminating, but not necessarily compelling. And I think that, but that has its strengths. However, I would add that voting for the lesser of two evils will not be the first time for me. I've done a lot of voting all my life, and it's often been the lesser of two evils.
Someone else here had a question?
Hi, everyone. Just to follow up on that question, do you think that what Pope Francis said is kind of in keeping with the non expedite statute that was put out a bunch of years ago? Is it not? It's kind of going off of what the other person said, but do you think that the Pope telling Catholics to choose the lesser of two evils is effectively the same as the non expedite principle, which was a statute put in place a number of decades ago saying that Catholics should refrain from voting altogether? Do you think that it's a bit different?
Did you get it, or she said, do you think the Pope's saying the voters should pick the lesser of two evils goes back to this principle that Catholics should refrain from participating in elections altogether, like the non-expectee principle? I didn't quite get that exactly.
Why don't you answer?
Oh, I don't know. I don't.
Felt like it was more an off-the-cuff remark than it was steeped in
Yeah, I'm not.
doctrine.
Yeah.
No, I said it felt much
Go
more
ahead.
off the cuff of a comment than it felt steeped in doctrine.
I will say that I don't think the Pope is the only one who feels that way, but it's, you know, it's
I don't know if I can.
I'll say something that sounds flip, but it's not meant to be flip. Better? Is that better? Okay. I just said I'm going to say something that will sound flip, but it's not meant to be flip. The question was roughly, I'm paraphrasing, so bear along with me, that the issue of abortion has become less of a moral one and more of a political sort of a, you know, where do you stand on the issue, and are there things that are actual moral conversations that we need to have, and where do we stand there? My view, and I guess that's why I call it women's health, if you listen to my remarks, I think if we just think about abortion as a very specific medical procedure, we kind of are missing the mark on what it all entails in terms of women's health and women's reproductive rights or privileges. And I say that because I think it's very important as men and women that we actually talk to each other about what that means, right? So not just, the concept of abortion, but what does that mean when women say that, I can't, if I'm in a certain state in this nation, I can't, I don't have access to certain health procedures, I don't have access to certain medications, I don't have access to certain doctors and expertises. So I think for me, it's like if I think about less about the big splashy headline, we pro-choice, we don't want an abortion. When you go a few layers deeper, you start to get in a different type of conversation. That's the essence of what we as a community, I think, need to grapple with.
Any last question? We tried to keep this within an hour. So if I may just thank everybody for coming tonight. As you know, after everybody is invited into the dining room of our rectory for a little reception. And if you would once again thank with me our very, very accomplished speakers, Peter, Will, and Amina. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.